UFOs, ghosts, ancient civilizations, the supernatural.
I know about security, and you don't lie if you can help it, but you be evasive.
We may never know the truth about what's really going on, but it sure is fun to speculate.
This is a new edit of the very first interview I ever did before I even had a show. All I had was my Facebook page. And the very first interview got to be one of my heroes, Stanton Friedman. Great man, funny, humorous. He's been around for a long time. He admits himself that you try not to lie, but you be evasive and stuff like that. And there's times you catch him being evasive. He believes in UFOs and all that other stuff, but he doesn't think that we should have access necessarily to any of the tech. But anyway, it was very cool getting to talk to him because watching his videos really helped me to wake up about a lot of things, even about some of the things he may be lying about. So here it is, my very first interview. All right, I am Steve Crawford, and I am here with one of my favorite heroes of ever. If you are in the UFO world at all, and you are a sci-fi buff like I am, you have heard of this man. Stanton Friedman, thank you so much for taking my call. How are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing fine here in the snowfall in Fredericton, New Brunswick.
Fantastic. Yeah, not too many people know you're a Canadian resident.
Well, I'm a Canadian citizen as well as an American citizen. I can complain about both governments legally.
Well, that's fantastic. That's mainly why I got you on here, too. So for the people who don't know who you are, why don't you give us a quick little explanation of who you are and why they should listen to you?
Okay, well, I grew up in New Jersey. It wasn't my fault, but I got bachelor's and master's degrees in physics at the University of Chicago in the mid-'50s. Carl Sagan and I were classmates for 3 years.
I heard that.
I worked in industry then for 12 years on exciting, definitely classified, eventually canceled advanced technology programs, nuclear airplanes for General Electric, fission rockets for Westinghouse, compact nuclear systems for General Nucleonics. Mm-hmm. And I made the switch to being a full-time ufologist when I thought I was going out west to take the most exciting job I'd ever heard of. I was supposed to figure out how flying saucers work for McDonnell Douglas in Santa Monica. And wow, that would have been great. I'd already given a couple hundred lectures. As I was driving across the country, it turned out that the program that was supporting that work was canceled. Nice to walk into the employment office and they say, you realize we just laid off 5,000 people.
Oh, no.
So they kept me on for 3 months, and I had a short job with TRW Systems working on the Pioneer spacecraft, tiny little nuclear systems. And then I realized I'd have to look out for my family, and I worked hard to get lectures, and that was 1970 or so. Here I am. I've given over 700 lectures in all 10 provinces, all 50 states, 18 other countries, written 5 books, answered, I figured once, 60,000 questions at the end of my lectures and on radio and television programs. I bring to bear my peculiar background. First of all, one of the biggest objections from what I call the nasty, noisy negativists is you can't get here from there, Stan. And I point out that I worked on nuclear airplanes, fission rockets, did a study of fusion rockets. You can get here from there, not easily, not cheaply, and most of the ancient academics that I have to contend with have no idea that these programs went on, and they weren't small. The Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department at General Electric in 1958 spent $100 million, employed 3,500 people, 1,100 of them were engineers and scientists.
Wow.
That's $100 million is a lot of money in 1958.
And that was a canceled program.
That was canceled. Yeah, we didn't operate a nuclear-powered airplane. Now, at Westinghouse, we had successful operation of a nuclear rocket reactor propulsion system on the ground.
Very cool.
And then they canceled the program after that. Now, it was a small one, only 1,100 megawatts, which is half the power of Grand Coulee Dam. Los Alamos operated one 4,400 megawatts, twice the power of Grand Coulee Dam, less than 8 feet in diameter. But they canceled the program. Another thing I bring to bear is that I worked under security for, well, it was 14 years, not 12 years. And many people don't seem to understand how security works. Mm-hmm. I'm currently looking into the Operation Majestic 12 documents, and people think, well, those people who supposedly were on it, surely they would have talked to their wives. And I say, no way, Jose. I never told my wife anything classified.
Exactly.
I mean, I've been to 20 archives. I'm a bloodhound. I go after facts and data. Mm-hmm. I go by a rule I learned in the 5th grade when a teacher said something wrong in a science class, and I piped up, and she gave me a hard time, so I brought in the encyclopedia I just read the day before. But the basic rule is have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear.
Exactly. I was going to say, you're not just giving lectures, you're presenting facts. That's all there is to it, and saying this is why it is completely plausible.
Well, yeah, and also I try to raise the objections of the debunkers and demolish them rather than ignore them.
I know, it's really fun to watch you do that.
Well, I've done debates, including Oxford University Debating Society, and we won, got 60% of the vote, and that felt good. Mm-hmm. I also have debated on Coast to Coast Radio. Dr. Seth Shostak of the SETI organization. I tell people SETI, S-E-T-I, stands for Silly Effort to Investigate, not for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, because it's based on a bunch of unscientific assumptions.
Well, and old technology, how could we possibly assume that anyone that may be as far as a million years more advanced than us would still be operating on radio waves?
That's a very good question. I don't use, there's a lot of old technology we don't use anymore.
And yet we're still doing searches with them.
Well, no, I mean, I don't use a slide rule anymore. I did use those when I started work in industry, and I had a whole class that I was talking to at a university in Michigan when I mentioned that when I started work, I was using a slide rule and looked around, no reaction. Any of you know what a slide rule is? Not one person! Oh, did I feel old? Well, it's very important to recognize that technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. The future is not an extrapolation of the past.
Exactly.
You have to change how you do things. And we don't like to admit that, maybe, but that's what's going on. I don't use a slide rule. Today's computers are much more improved over the ones I started using years and years ago. A laser isn't a better light bulb. It's entirely different physics.
Exactly.
And one of the things that's irksome is how astronomers who don't know anything about developing advanced technology, that goes on in industry and in national labs, not at universities, for goodness sakes. Mm-hmm. And they don't seem to understand that people can keep secrets, that advanced technology is being worked at in very large programs. Well, as a good example of that, I've had people tell me, Stan, look, you say there was a saucer crash at Roswell, and I do. I was the original civilian investigator of the Roswell incident. Mm-hmm. But, Stan, if that had happened, they'd have had to pull half the physicists out of college campuses to work on that. And I laughed and said, you've got to be kidding.
Exactly.
Are you really unaware of Los Alamos and Sandia and Livermore? And a whole bunch of other national labs, thousands of employees with security clearances, mind you.
And people think we're just making this up. That's the silly thing. And the people that I talk to, I hear a lot of, it's moon or Venus refracting alpha swamp gas. Now let's get into J. Allen Hynek for a minute, because he was the one who came up with that theory originally, was he not?
Well, Alan was the chairman of the astronomy department at Northwestern University, and for 20 years he was the scientific consultant to the Air Force Project Blue Book, which lasted from the early 50s until 1969.
Mm-hmm.
And it just so happens there was a big fuss about sightings up in Michigan, and he came up with an explanation. The Air Force was pressuring him. We got to say something. People are giving us a hard time. Well, he said one possible explanation for some of these cases is swamp gas. And that went over like a lead balloon.
Mm-hmm.
And there were over 100 cartoons done in his honor across the country.
Now, at that point, he hadn't even looked at a UFO case, right?
Well, he had looked at a UFO case. He was a consultant for many years.
Wow.
Now, he wasn't into technology. I could never get him to look at all the work on interstellar travel. Most astronomers aren't.
Mm-hmm.
They're still stuck with chemical rockets, which is about as useful as saying that, how long does it take to go around the planet? Well, it took Magellan 3 years, his ship. He didn't make it. That's a good standard. Well, the space station does it in 90 minutes.
Yep.
It doesn't use big sails. So I try to get people to understand. Well, I just had a critic yesterday saying, well, how come there aren't any sightings by astronomers? They walk around with telescopes and they're looking at the skies. Utterly ridiculous comment, because there are sightings by astronomers. They're recorded in Allen's book, The UFO Experience, in a book by a professor from Stanford University, Peter, whatever his name is. I'll come up with it in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting old. Anyway, he had a bunch of them. He surveyed. Dr. James E. McDonald, in his testimony before Congress, had a number of sightings by astronomers.
Mm-hmm.
This was Dr. Peter Sturck, whose name I was looking for.
Well, and wouldn't we also have to assume that a lot of these places would be government-controlled? And the government's not going to just let people, you would have to report it to the government first, correct? I would assume.
Well, people, what's happened is there's been a climate of ridicule created by the nasty, noisy negativists.
Yeah.
And when I check my audiences at the end of my lectures, I frequently ask how many people here believe they've seen what I would consider to be a flying saucer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I prefer the term flying saucer because all flying saucers are UFOs. Only a few UFOs are flying saucers.
All
great-grandfathers are men. Not all men are great-grandfathers.
Exactly.
I happen to be one, a great-grandfather. But
congratulations.
Anyway, I try to put the facts out on the table for people.
Mm-hmm.
And when I talk about 5 large-scale scientific studies, I ask my audiences how many people have read this, and typically it's fewer than 2% have read any of them. Well, what I started to say about polling my audience after the lecture,
right?
Typically 10% of the hands will go up when I ask how many people have seen something.
Mm-hmm.
And to the surprise, they start off just barely over their heads. This is after hearing me lecture.
Yeah.
And as I move across the hall, the hands go up higher and firmer because suddenly people realize they're not the only ones.
Exactly.
Typically 10%. But then I ask, how many of you reported what you saw? 90% of the hands go down.
Yeah.
Now, if there's anybody left, I ask another question. How many of you were in the military at the time? There's still some hands up. I will say, you want to tell us about it? One guy in Texas at a university said, I can't. They told me not to say anything. Great line.
And people
Another
don't
guy
get
said,
that.
they took my pictures. And that's all he said.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I'm not asking your name. You don't need to stand up, but I'm sure the audience would like to hear the rest of the story. And he told about flying a 4-engine airplane, Air Force plane, out over the Pacific. Plane ahead, radios back, saucer heading your way. They had gun cameras. They took pictures. They reported, they called the base to which they were flying, radioed, and told them they were bringing in film. The crew doesn't handle the film. That's intelligent stuff. And they landed, gave up the film, and they were debriefed and told never to say anything. And I'll tell you, that guy sure came across well. That's not the only time I've heard stories like that. But so I get out there, and I've only had 11 hecklers, and 2 of them were drunk. You're going to get that many if you talk about sports, religion, or politics.
Exactly. So that's pretty good.
Yeah, I'm not a masochist. I don't do this because I like the slings and arrows of outraged debunkers. I'll take them on anywhere. And, it's strange because I just did a paper for the Mutual UFO Network about press coverage of the subject, which is, from pretty lousy most of the time. And three of the people that have given a bad name to UFOs are science fiction writers: Isaac Asimov, Ben Bova, and Arthur C. Clarke.
Yep. Yeah.
And they've all said dumb things, and I don't hesitate to say that. Look, Isaac Asimov was a great writer. I would never say that he wasn't. But he said they will either, if we're coming here, they'd either stay hidden or they'd land and make themselves known. If they do neither, they're not alien spacecraft. Like, he's an expert on alien behavior.
Yeah.
And the thing people don't seem to understand, we live on a planet on which $1 trillion will be spent this year on things military.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that means we're not very nice guys, but it also means that anybody flying here is in trouble because anybody down here would like to grab himself a flying saucer so we could duplicate the technology and use it in warfare.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're all about. And I don't know what the young generation learns, but we should be reinforced in our knowledge that 50 million people died in World War II on this planet because of the war.
Yeah.
50 million. 1,700 cities were destroyed. We're a primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare.
Yeah.
And anybody, why don't they land on the White House lawn? It's a no-fly zone.
Mm. Well, there's those theories that we're quarantined, that they're making sure we don't leave this planet until we're ready. And
I agree.
Have you personally seen anything?
No, I've never seen a flying saucer. Look, I spent 14 years chasing neutrons and gamma rays. Never saw one.
Yeah.
They're real
and
too.
Yet you still believe, because it makes perfect sense.
Yes.
Exactly. That's my point. That's what I try to get across to people. You don't, just because you don't believe the truth doesn't mean it ceases to exist. You don't have to see something for it. How many people believe in God? They haven't seen him, but they believe. I mean, come on.
That's right. That's right. And, courts of law, preponderance of the evidence, rarely beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, if I told you I saw a 747 fly over my house, you say, well, I don't believe you. You got to show me a motion picture.
Yep.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
We take people's word. The reason most sightings can be explained as relatively conventional phenomena seen under perhaps unusual circumstances is that people are good observers.
Mm-hmm.
We know it was Venus because they were pointing in the right direction. They had the time right. They described its behavior properly. It was Venus. They didn't know it was Venus, but a dispassionate observer will say, yeah, good witness. It's not like if you're describing a bank robber and you say he was 6 feet plus or minus 20%.
Yeah.
You got to do better than that if you're trying to separate one person out.
Well, and people get arrested and put away with less evidence these days than there is to support the claims of UFOs' existence, And so, I mean, they can't say, not enough evidence, not enough evidence. Well, if you're willing to believe a tabloid story just because it was shown on TV once, then why would you not believe stuff that has evidence? I mean, it's insane.
We're not taught how to look at evidence. So listen to the story and how good does it sound. That's what matters.
Exactly. We want to be told stories. We want to be lulled. And when nobody wants to think that there's somebody out there that could squash us like bugs if they chose to. And I can understand that. But, hiding from it isn't going to make it disappear. We should be embracing it, and everybody on this planet should have access to this information. Could you imagine we would be living, if people took Nikola Tesla and put him on a pedestal instead of Edison, we would be living a Star Trek life now. I bring that up because, of course, January 17th, we're going to be at the University of Waterloo with Garrett Wong from Star Trek Voyager, and he's very interested in this stuff. He's a big fan of yours, too, so it's going to be a really fun night. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to mention a couple. We don't want to give people too much of what we're going to be talking about that night, so I'd like to mention a couple of names, and you tell me what you know about them, if you know about them, or what you think about them, and their stories. One would be Bill Cooper.
Bill Cooper was a liar and a cheat and died a suitable death. I don't say that by many people. He shootout with sheriff's authorities. Mm-hmm. And he claimed in his book, Behold the Pale Horse, that a research grant that I had from the Fund for UFO Research, well, it was really CIA money, and Stan works for the CIA. And that's total malarkey.
I think you'd be living a lot better if you did. I did want to work for the government. I delivered mail for the U.S. Post Office for 2 weeks in 1952.
as a student at Rutgers University.
Okay, so we won't go too much more about Bill because he is gone now. But so that's okay. Gary McKinnon.
Well, I admire his guts. He's the guy who dug into the hacking files
From the UK, correct?
Yeah, and good for the UK government in not letting him come over here. Forwarding him and saying,
I hear he suffers from autism or something as well.
Yes, he does. And so I admire his guts in speaking out. I was surprised he got in as far as he did, although I guess yesterday there was a big hacking story about Sony, and apparently the biggest hacking story there's ever been about somebody getting into somebody else's files. But I have a secret admiration for Gary, let's put it that way.
Do you believe what he found or what he alleges he found is plausible?
I'll give it a maybe.
Considering you do believe Roswell happened, and if it did, then logically, if they were able to deduce some of this technology, would they or would they not, want to be secure in case they did know of an impending threat, or even just building bases on the moon for safety reasons?
Security is a way of life. Look, the Washington Post last year said that the total black budget that is not under direct congressional control for military intelligence work was $52.6 billion.
Wow.
That's an awful lot of money. That's NSA, CIA, and NRO, National Reconnaissance Office, for most of it, more than 80% or so. So, of course you cover up stuff. That's what happens. That's their duty. And people think, it comes out quick sooner or later, mostly later. A good example of that, we had broken the German codes in the early part of World War II, and it was of enormous importance to know.
That's
where
right. They recovered a decoder and fixed it. That's right. I remember that.
And you'd think that, and we had to distribute the information very carefully because if the Germans found out we'd broken their code, they'd change it, and that would give us a very tough time. Well, as it happens, there was no public word about the fact that Project Ultra had been successful until 25 years after the war.
Yeah.
And our first spy satellite, the Corona spy satellite, which just happens to be the small town nearest to where the Roswell event took place, small world, went up after 13 failures, 12 failures. The 13th one was successful. Got more data about Soviet technology, rocket launching facilities, all that sort of stuff, than all the U-2 flights which preceded it. We didn't go public with that. The Russians knew we were flying it until almost 30 years afterward. You keep secrets. Because
and there was good reason back then, but, things are different now. Well, they would be different now, but it's almost like they're trying to keep a perpetual war going so they can continue with the secrets. That's my opinion, but
that might well be. People, want to continue. It's Newton's law. People in motion want to continue in motion unless a force is exerted to change it. And people who, the constant Cold War, for example, people don't realize how important that was and how much money went into sometimes crazy ideas. But it was always on the basis, one up the Russians, because at the beginning, we underestimated their capability. General Groves, who headed the Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb, was asked in 1948 how long it would take before the Russians had a bomb. And he said, they were devastated by the war and so forth. It'll take them at least 8 years, and they don't even have a means for delivering it. They don't have an air force of their own planes. Their first Russian atomic bomb was the next year, 1949. And their delivery system, the United States had left the B-29 over there during the war, and they built a bunch more of them, upgraded it a bit, but and all of a sudden, in a secret meeting of the National Security Council, it was stated in 1951, the Russians had made more progress in the development of nuclear weapons and methods for delivering them in the past 18 months than had been expected for 5 years from now. And that scared the heck out of those people in Washington, believe me.
No, I guess it
And so, the world was a different sort of place. But and people ask me, why the secrecy? The fear of panic? I don't think that's it.
I'm sure in some small part, it's definitely not the main reason.
Well, in the back of everybody's head, you worry about what the impact will be. But first rule is you want to figure out how the darn things work. They make wonderful weapons delivery and defense systems. You got Roswell wreckage. You set up your secret project. And you can't tell your friends without telling your enemies.
Exactly.
We tend to forget that. They read the newspapers too.
Yeah.
And so secrecy is just a big part of the picture. And will continue to be. And also, there is a little question. People say, Stan, don't you think we're entitled to know everything? And I say, no, there's a national security aspect. What do you mean? Look, if we were to put our knowledge that we have gained from studying crash flying saucers and flying saucers out on the table, you think the Russians and Chinese would put theirs out too? If they don't, why should we put ours out?
Yeah.
They could use what we've learned and what they've learned, and maybe they wind up ahead of us.
Yeah, they've released files, but not technology.
Well, there's a difference between saying, yes, the planet's being visited, and we're having international meetings at which we will look at the psychological and religious and economic
ramifications,
philosophical aspects of that, and putting everything out on the table. I worked under security for 14 years, so I'm conscious of that. It matters.
Yeah, you're not just making this up.
Yes.
Okay.
Who do sink ships?
They really do. Okay. How about Billy Meyer?
Well, I knew Wendell Stevens, and I found that he wasn't telling the truth a good deal of the time. And so I have not accepted the Billy Meyer story as being legitimate. He's the guy who claims a lot of interactions with aliens in Switzerland and took pictures, of a tree that isn't there when people go to look for it and stuff like that.
And claimed something about they went back in time and moved it or something like that.
Yeah.
And,
Oh, yeah. Very imaginative.
So you don't think those pictures, at least, are anything?
No.
They're probably fake.
Yeah.
At least in your opinion. Okay, now here's one you probably may not know about because it's not specifically UFO, but I'm sure you've heard of it being in the circles you're in. How about Andrew Basiago? Time travel.
Yeah, I've read some of his stuff about Serpo. We've got a base on Mars.
Jump room.
Yeah, the last one I heard was that Obama had been one of the people who went up there, and it didn't take any time out of their life because they were pushed forward and then back in time.
Mm-hmm.
And I am very dubious. I even wrote a column. I do a monthly column for the MUFON Journal about the Serpo story.
Mm-hmm.
And, there have been imaginative science fiction writers for generations.
Be evasive.
But that doesn't mean that they're telling the truth as opposed to fiction.
Mm-hmm. But I think at this point, nobody can debunk him. I think he found himself a little niche, so he doesn't really have to. He's like, well, I can't prove it, but you can't disprove it. So
well, yeah, that's the onus should be on him to make a claim, establish it.
Mm-hmm.
Don't tell me, well, if you can't disprove it, that means it's true. That's false logic.
Yeah, it really is. Okay, and one more. How about Nick Pope?
I know Nick. I consider him a friend. I think, he's gone a little political, and I think he's gone overboard in his attacks on one of the guys who was one of the first off the starter point on the Rendlesham case.
Right.
But he's a pretty solid guy, even if he does get off once in a while.
And Nick's from the UK. He used to be with the Ministry of Defense there, for people who don't know.
Yeah, he lives in the States now, incidentally.
Okay.
Yeah, he was one of the very few people who can say he was paid to investigate UFO reports.
Mm-hmm.
He was the UFO desk at the Ministry of Defense.
That is very cool. Okay, Stanton, I'm not going to take up any more of your time because I have more interviews to do as well.
Don't forget www.stantonfriedman.com. Find out about my book.
Exactly. Buy a book. You're going to love it. This guy's fantastic. See you soon, Stanton. You have a great night.
Thanks. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Conspiracy Factor Theory.